Where's my repository implementation? There, new Dart test file, authentication, repository implementation. Now, for this, what is our dependency? Remember, what we need to know our dependency. First of all, our dependency is going to be the mock auth repo. I'm just going to I actually prefer to shorten this because I don't know, it's gonna be very long if I write out that entire authentication repository implementation. Personally, I just shorten it. You can leave it as long as you want. So plus mock auth repo implementation extends mock from the mock tail, implement the authentication repository. That is really long. So you can see why I prefer to shorten that. And then finally we have our dependency mocked and ready to be manipulated. So let's go ahead and create our void main, the entry point for our tests. So this is where our tests will start. Let's go ahead and do the setup. So for our setup, for each test, we actually want to create, we actually want to create a new repo implementation, which will be whatever. So let's create that here. Await authentication. No, sorry about that. Our dependency is not the repository implementation. Our repository is rather the authentication remote data source. I'm so sorry. That is our dependency, not the other thing. So it's rather the mock auth remote data source. I'm going to write src for that source. This is a bad practice. You probably want to do that, but don't care. It's not a real project. Authentication. So my late authentication remote data source. Notice how I'm not writing the mock over here and just telling this right away that it's mock. I just prefer to write the actual class, right, so that we know what I'm looking for. And then when I'm creating it in the setup, I rather replace the instance with the mock version of it. So we're looking for the remote data source. We also need our late authentication repository implementation. That's a long name, repo implementation. For this, we're going to call the authentication repository implementation the real version of it, right? Because we're not going to be manipulating or pulling any actual sources in here, so we don't want to mock it. We only mock our dependencies. So in this mock, I'm just going to remove this. It's going to use this one. Then before I actually instantiate this one, I'm gonna create the dependency, so that by the time that this gets created, as you can see, the local variable is definitely unassigned at this point, so that by the time we create this will be assigned. So let's go ahead and do that before data source will be equal to the mock auth remote data source. And that's it. We're done with our setup. Now, how does this test actually work? Remember, I told you that we're going to test the functions one after another. So first function we're going to test will be the create user. So remember that inside of the create user, we're going to be testing for two things. First of all, to check if it calls the remote data source. Secondly, and to make sure that if... So we could do this in two different tests. We could also make sure that it returns the proper data if there is no exception. So these are the things we're going to be doing. Make sure that it calls the remote data source. We're also going to make sure that it returns the proper data if there's no exception. This is basically a sub of this. So this is the broader term. We can put this in here. Also check that when it throws an exception, return a failure. And if it doesn't throw an exception, return the actual expected data that was fulfilled over here. So we first of all make sure that it returns the proper data if there's no exception. but then check if there's an exception, right? And then we return a failure if there was an exception. So these are the three things we're going to be doing. But then sometimes I prefer to join this into this. We can put that into one test, and you're going to see how I'm going to do that, so that we don't have too many tests. But then first of all, we have a function, a method to test. So for each method, you want to create a group. Sorry, I'm outside of the void main. I have to be inside the void main. So we want to create a group. This is a group. A group just simply is a group of tests. We're going to be writing more than one test, so we want to put that in a group. We're going to be writing more than one test for a single functionality, so that's why we put it in a group. So what functionality are we writing the multiple tests for? It's the create user. You write the name of the function the way it appears. Where is our repository implementation? This is it. So we write that way. We close this out, and we go ahead and say and start with our test. So the first test will be a test. The description, remember, what are we trying to do? We're trying to, make sure that it calls the remote data source. And remember, I wanted to join this into it as well. So should call the remote data, the remote data source dot create user, and return the proper data. In this case, we're not returning anything because create user is returning void. So let's, instead of returning and complete successfully when the call is successful, when the call to the remote source is successful. Let me go ahead and cut that bit. That is super long. Let's go ahead and do that. That should solve that. Asynchronous function. Now we start writing our test. So we want to make sure that we call the remote data source, and we want to make sure that it completes successfully when the call to remote source is successful. How are we going to do that? So if we want to make sure that the create user got called, right, we want to use the verify. We verify that the remote data source dot create user got called with what values? With whatever values that we pass. We want to make sure that it got called with the correct data as well. So we're checking for three things inside of this function. Check that remote sources create user gets called and with the right data. So and then we make sure that it got called successfully. So in order to, well, this will actually tell us if it got called. Then passing in these will tell us if it got called with the right data. And how do we know that the data is the right data? We know that because whenever we call the remote data source, we're calling it from the repository implementation. The repository implementation would take these data and pass it to this person. So meaning that in order to make sure that this gets called with the right data, we just want to make sure that whatever data is here matches whatever data that was given to the repository implementation. So this is the assert part. Now we have two parts. We have arrange. I just started with assert because I don't want to confuse you. If I started from, I just want to start from doing this and show you how or why we need arrangements, right? So now I'm going to take care of these later. So this will actually take care of that. We also want to make sure that it got called once, right? We want to make sure that it got called once. Now this will take care of this part. Now we also want to make sure that it completed successfully when the call to remote source is successful. So in here, in our arrange part, when the remote data source dot create user gets called with any named created at any named, any named name named so once the remote data source gets called with any of these values, we don't need to mock the values because these are strings, they're Dart types, they're native Dart types. I don't think we need to mock them, we don't need to. So anytime this function, this method, Command L, yes, so anytime that method gets called with any value at all, anytime this method gets called, this is basically what we're saying, dot then answer, we're using answer because it's a future, then answer with your invocation, which we don't need. We need this to be async. Always remember for this to be async. Always answer with a write. A write means no. The remote source doesn't return right or left. It just returns void. So always return with the proper void value. So we can't return void. Dart will not let us do that. So whenever you're returning void, you should use future.value instead. So anytime that this gets called, always return a future value. Always return the correct data. Don't throw any exceptions, because in this case we're testing to see if it returns the right value when it's successful. So this is also where dependency injection comes in handy, right? So because our dependency, we can manipulate the dependency and make sure that when we're testing for success, that it's always successful. So this is what dependency inversion does for us. This is where it's beautiful. Now we have hijacked the return type, the return value, or the functionality of dependency, and we're saying whenever you get called, always return success. Now we're also checking to see that whenever there's success, we also want to make sure that the function, the actual repository implementation that we're calling, the create user over here, completes successfully. And how do we do that? First of all, we act. So we act and we say the final results will be equal to, we can say it's equal to await for the repository implementation dot create user with some values, right? We can come back to that later. We wait for that to complete, and then we expect that the results is equal to, so remember that whenever the create user gets called and it returns successfully, right, we always want this to complete successfully. And how does it complete successfully? It will return a right value, because this is either failure or void, and the void is always on the right, so we always wanted to return a right hand user. This might be a lot to take in. If you're confused, go back in the video and start from whatever you got lost at. But then we're just going to make sure, expect that the result will always be a right. A right what? A right in this case is going to be null. Why is it null? Because it's void. And we can't say a right void. So whenever there's a void, your right hand type will always have a null value inside of it. So we can check this and say equals, that the result is equal to a constant right hand type, and that's it.